Dr. Martin is up next, and it was my job to introduce him. I did sit down and try and prepare a snapshot of your history, and to assist me with that, I found a CV that was 24 pages long. So after several drafts, I realised that there was no way I could do justice to your level of experience. So I'll just say that Dr. Martin's got a comprehensive history in all things land rights and community governance related, and we're very fortunate to be able to learn from some of that experience today.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know what's in that 24. I wonder if it includes the time that I wrote a thesis on global warming as a chemical engineer in Boggo Road Jail in Brisbane. I wonder whether it included that. That's part of my history. Before I start, however, I too want to, I think it behoves us sitting in this beautiful building here in this very rich city to think about those whose country this was before the colonists arrived and on the consequences of that colonisation for those people. We are fortunate indeed, but it's us who are the fortunate ones. I was really impressed with the two presentations. I thought they were really fascinating. One of the questions I had is in relation to Sana's talk about the Guruma Mataduna PBC. Was there any anthropological input into that? It struck me as an extraordinarily interesting example of a multi-dimensional PBC, but I imagine it's based on substantial flows of income from the mining on their country. In other words, the destruction of their country, I need to be closer, yes, thank you. The destruction of their country has led to the possibility of a PBC for them, at least of that calibre and size. But we can come back to that in questioning. So first, what's the relationship between the king plates? Those of you who don't know, the early colonists had the same problem that faces us all, this completely differently structured, not societies, we know from yesterday, but sets of people, very different ways of operating than mainstream Australia, and certainly the colonists, the early colonists. And what they did is they invented a kind of a way of dealing with these amorphous, apparently leaderless groups of people when they weren't moving them away or worse, is to find someone who seemed to have authority and then have a king plate, King Billy of the such and such. Mostly men. But I know in South Australia examples of women having queen plates, and the purpose of it was they were the go-to, and then they would be the way through which communication with the wider group was. That's what a PBC is. PBCs are not there, I don't believe. They're a political development, heavily coloured by the right wing of the Labor Party in Queensland, who strenuously resisted having anything similar to the Northern Territory land councils. They didn't want powerful bodies, and so the PBC sits there as a corporation designed specifically to be the interface between, most particularly, our land and resource system in the wider society and the governments and the wider world development. The go-to, like the king plates, the go-to. In this case, it's a corporate person, not an individual person, but it serves the same purpose and it has the same limitations. I think the two presentations just now showed how, especially Sana's, shows how the resourcing of a PBC can turn it into a complex, multifaceted institution serving a whole range of goals in the intersection of Matagundra people and the wider society. It's a stunning and outstanding example. But others are not in the same position, and we all know PBCs that are struggling or worse. Certainly the WIC PBC, part of my history is getting into anthropology as a result of living and working with WIC people in Cape York and becoming interested in the options, that the ways of thinking that anthropology provided. Their PBC is in a terminal state, really, and it's for a whole set of reasons which lie beyond the capacity, well, the formal capacity of the WIC people to address. They're simply stifled from doing so. So what I'm talking about here is what I see as common mistakes or misapprehensions in the establishment of PBCs, and what might we as anthropologists, knowing what we know about Aboriginal political and ethical systems, what might we have to give into that, into the design of those corporations, overwhelmingly performed by lawyers, but not only. What I want to show here, this ghastly diagram, and this is a residual from my being an engineer, right? We think in certain ways, so I apologise, but it's really to show that we talk, a lot of our talk, and I'll talk about this later on too, a lot of our discussion centres around the governance of the corporation. What we heard from the last two presentations was a whole set of other things they do, which all involve different aspects of governance. This diagram tries to reflect that. What it's trying to do is to show that the one that we mostly talk about is the governance of the relationship between the PBC and the corporation, but there's a whole lot of other arenas that the PBC has to work in willy-nilly. The PBC has to be responsible to and deal with government, it has to deal with ORIC, the regulator, and so forth. There are multiple levels in which, we saw this too in the recent presentations, multiple levels in which it's dealing with the constituency, the native title holders. Some of that will involve the board, others may not. It's one of the matters I want to talk about. One of the key issues which underlie what I'm going to talk about here is, where does power lie? Does it lie within the corporation, or does it remain largely with the native title holders, and over what matters? And there's a lot of legal issues around that, or legal mechanisms. I'll briefly skip around. For example, the regulations, the PBC regulations, give one of the key elements, how are decisions to be made about the native title. There's a really major one between whether the PBC is set up as an agent PBC or as a trust PBC. In other words, does the native title ownership of the native title, holding of the native title, lie with the native title holders themselves, or does it lie with the board? That's the trust PBC. But an agent PBC, the boards cannot make decisions in the absence of decisions to do so agreed to by the traditional owners. The board cannot make, the directors cannot make decisions about native title matters in a term that Aboriginal people that I've worked with use a lot, with their own thinking. And yet I've seen, in fact, the WIC PBC itself has been consistently making decisions without reference to the native title holders, or with minimal reference. So these different governance arenas are critical, and I think in particular those concerning the character of the PBC, the structure, the principles and so forth, and how it's going to work, how it's going to work in protecting the native title, how it's going to work in terms of the critical thing for many, and it's certainly a massive thing for PBCs in the Pilbara region, for example, would be how is it going to administer the trust, its objective, its role as a trustee. And Guruma Matadunera had a very innovative way, I thought, of doing that. So there's a huge emphasis placed on the governance of the corporation itself. It seems to be the primary one in discussions that I hear around. These have, if you look at the quantum of material, the CATSI Act, under which PBCs, they're prescribed body corporate, certain of their characteristics are prescribed in law, and one is that the regulator is the ORIC, that the CATSI Act itself is a thick tome. Underlying that, is the, I don't normally hit things like that, but anyway, underneath that is the Corporations Act. Underneath that is, amongst other things, from the judge yesterday, the common law and so forth. It's this massive amount of information. But when you look then at two arenas, one is its role, that PBC's role as either an agent or a trustee for the native title, it's fairly minimal. It's in particular, it's the two PBC regulations, 7 and 8. They set out the basic principles by which decisions about native title should be made, and consultation with the native title holders, depending on exactly the nature of the matter and so forth. And then is even less with its role as a trustee. As I recall it, and I'll rely on the lawyers amongst us here to give us the full answer, but as I understand it, it's basically in one clause in the Act which says that the PBC will act in terms of using money that's come from compensation. The PBC will act on the directions of the native title holders. That's a vast arena. When you think, for example, of what Sana was talking about, that whole multiple kind of complexities in the way that they'd set up the structures and the way in which trust monies would be used and so forth. There's very little attention given by lawyers, and it's something that we I believe we can contribute to. So I think there's too much. It's not that we shouldn't focus on internal governance. It must be focused on. It's critical, but it's not only that. It's how it works. It's as I've been saying. It's the distribution of power as between the corporation and the beneficiaries in the case of the trust or the native title holders. That's a critical thing. It's one of the things that should go into the design of when one's working with a group to assist in the design of a corporation. It's one of the questions which I ask and would always suggest asking: where should power lie? For example, commonly phrased like, should directors be able to make a decision about matter X or Y with their own thinking, or do they have to go back to the native title holders and get instructions on how to think, how to decide, which is what PBC Regulations 7 and 8 are essentially about. There's a very common misapprehension, and it's not just amongst anthropologists. I heard it from an ex-federal court judge a week out from his having left the federal court, sitting and talking to a mate. I just happened to be nearby and overheard it. And this federal court judge said, you know, it's only last week I realised that there's a difference between the native title holders and the members of the corporation. So if a federal court judge can elide the difference, so can we anthropologists. And then another one, which I think is, and I think both Sana and, my God, my age, Corrie, my old mate, sorry, both referred to, and that is that they talk about bringing key elements, and they're right, key elements of the distinctiveness of the group concerned into the design of the corporation. But it's a question as to what level and how deep that goes. So very often it involves having, for example, we had 6 representatives, a board of 6, each representing a particular family line, 6 or 7. And that's a very common one. But there are cases where they go more deeply into it, into the having native the people's own culture, in a sense, built into the corporation. I think it's worth thinking through, again, this question of power. How much power should the corporation have, and how much should be left with people? I'll come back to that later on again. But I think that I think that we need to think through some of the matters that anthropology over its history of working with learning to understand the complexities of the Aboriginal world. We need to think about their implications for the kind of representative corporation that's standard. Think about, for example, the primacy of the local group, not just as in terms of, in much of Australia, in terms of the land-holding unit, the clan, as conventional anthropology would say. Think about the ethical and moral entailments of kinship. It's one of the things that I learned deeply embedded in my understanding before I became an anthropologist of 8 years in Arakoon, is that one's ethical responsibilities are absolutely paramount in terms of close kin, and the further away someone is in terms of kin and related connections, the less obligations one had towards them, and the more likely relations would be competitive or perhaps even hostile, depending. So when we're talking about how do we fit this localism, is a term that's often used, in terms of ethical, political entailments and so forth. How do we build that into a corporation? Furthermore, into systems, and this will depend on who they are and their histories and so forth, where the very notion of representation itself cannot be taken for granted, the legitimacy of representation. People, certainly in the case of Wik people, were quite concerned about having anyone who wasn't a close relation representing them in a structure. It's something which is inherent in our own political system and so forth. At multiple levels, we give up whole areas of autonomy over our lives to institutions. Someone punches us out in the pub. Someone runs into us in a car. Multiple things. The right to make decisions, have a role in decisions in national events. Should we go to war with Trump's United States or something? That representation, we complain about it, but it's an intrinsic part of how we operate, how we understand from the local level to the national level. This is not necessarily the case or if it is, it's been imposed on people and will have varying degrees of legitimacy. It's not a taken for this is how things are. It needs to be thought about. We need to talk about people, about their notion of representation in the PBC, and whether, again, it goes back to this question of where does power lie and over what kinds of decisions and what kinds of actions. Yes, another one is that the assumption that this complexity and differentials between, say, family groupings can be dealt with adequately by each having a board member or something like that, right? Something simple like that. It may do, but it also may, for example, if you have what's called, what you might think of as an inclusive membership, that is the standard corporation, where CATSI corporation, where you have a quite large, or you can have a quite large membership. People apply to a board for membership. There can be a lot of shenanigans about that, as we know. People getting removed in order to stack the board, and so voting for the board, this kind of thing. That's now harder after a change in the Native Title Act that makes that more difficult to do, but it's still being done, I understand. All these things suggest that we as anthropologists, when we're looking at a corporation, should have a careful eye, again, to the issue of power, effectiveness, legitimacy, inclusiveness, and so forth, as we understand from either our practice, working with Aboriginal people, or our reading materials on political life of Aboriginal groups and this kind of thing. We have things to say that are useful in the design of these things. And I think also, certainly in my experience, but it clearly was not the case in the Guruma Mata Dunara one. I'd be fascinated to hear more from Sana about the design process there. And I've seen a similar one in a large PBC well south of there, with, again, a very large income on a yearly basis. We need to think about, where does the power lie? Is it open to manipulation? Is it open to gaming the system by, to quote an example from a Victorian PBC, wait until the other mob going down to visit into Melbourne here, to call a quick general meeting and completely change the board, this kind of thing. How do we minimise the risk of these kinds of instrumentalism when there is not an ethos of collectivity in the people that are together in a single claim? Okay, so this is getting down to more again, it just illustrates the whole set of this relationship between the PBC and the native title holders. It's just a whole set of, there's the PBC's rules that might cover it, well, which will be acted on. It's the broader question, the broader issue of important decisions around native title, whether it's an agent or a trust PBC. If it's a native title decision, something that's going to impact on the native title, then they're obliged to follow regulations 7 and 8, which says if you've got a traditional view about tradition about this, you follow that traditional way of making decisions. If not, then you've got to agree, a two-step process, agree on a process, and then follow that process. Looks simple, but is always complex in its operation. So that's something that needs to be looked at, and increasingly it needs to be looked at in terms of the international international goal, as expressed for Indigenous peoples, First Nations peoples around the world, of free, prior and informed consent. That's the kind of, and that was mentioned, I think, in one of the presentations earlier on. So what I wanted to do, well, firstly, I'm looking here now more at trusts, and particularly trusts where large sums of money are coming in. And I've said that trying to capture the diversity and the structure of the corporation is not necessarily the only way to go. And at the end of this talk, I'll give an example, one example of a different way of doing it that's being brought into play. We saw another one, a very complex one, in the Guruma Matadunra example. What I'm saying is that what should be focused on very much more than just the mechanics of it and the structure of it, but the details of how the corporation, how the PBC is going to interact with its constituency. Again, we saw some wonderful, multifaceted discussion of this with Guruma Matadunra, but funded with a lot of money from mining companies. Not everyone's got that kind of level of funding. So it may not be able to be carried out at that complex level, but nonetheless, there needs to be in the design and implementation and then running of an effective PBC, how it deals with its constituency, how they can have a say in things. Again, this distribution of power, these are fundamental matters. They are ones that, again, I think we anthropologists, often through personal experience, will have useful things to say, it seems to me. And yes, I will be finished soon. Then yes, in the trusts, that's particularly important. There's some really quite disastrous cases of PBCs that have an annual distribution. Is one example that I haven't had anything to do with it, but read about at the AGM. Those who came to the AGM would be battling to get a share of the money, and that would then be determined, obviously, at the AGM by those in power or those who are able to muster a higher vote, which was a way of really ensuring, or at least not ensuring, but making very likely that the voiceless remained moneyless in terms of benefits and so forth. That's one extreme. So there needs to be, and I'm just suggesting, a thoroughgoing, it's more like a community development framework where money is not distributed out, and there's some catastrophic examples of that. Money's from, for example, the major developments which just get frittered away and end up in powerful individuals' pockets, which is an awful outcome for people, of course. It's working together in the design of a system in which equity of distribution of access to resources, and possibly not its distribution as money but as services. And you see all kinds of different cases. In the Pilbara, for example, white goods for old people, like in that extreme heats, air conditioners and things like that for senior people is one simple example of something that was opened up that people saw as important. And then, whoops, I was warned about that button with a big, with a big thumb, I hit it. What I'm looking at here is something that Petronella and I worked on in a wonderful team. It's not a PBC, but it shares a whole lot of characteristics. It's in the Yulara resort area at Uluru. The proposal is because it was purchased by the ILSC, under statute they have to return ownership to Aboriginal people, and it's been a process for the last year and a half, 2 years, I think, where we did intensive field trips into different parts of that broader animal world, and included very much in that was what should happen to money, who should control that, and what kind of a corporation was needed. And I won't go, both Petronella and I can answer the questions around the detailed process we followed, but it was very much, I think, very much co-design. We had lots of small meetings, we had fewer large ones. Large ones can be useful and essential for certain purposes. For others, you're far better off having a family group or a couple of family groups. You learn more about detail. People feel freer to talk about matters. And in a nutshell, because I don't want to go too much into detail, what they came up with, and as I say, a process of co-design, and still strongly, I made a phone call to check out, because it's still being implemented, continue to strongly support, is to have a membership, rather than the conventional corporation where you have your starting members and a starting board, but the board people apply to the board to become a member. In the old days, that was subject to quite a lot of manipulation. People would be kicked out or not allowed in because the board didn't agree that they were part of the group and so forth, and was therefore very susceptible to power politics and so forth. This goes the other way. It benefits the beneficiaries should be what was called essentially a bit like traditional owners, Ngurritja, Bidinjara and Yankujara people. They wanted very clearly, they wanted power to stay out of the corporation. They didn't want the board to be making decisions, important decisions about with their own thinking. There were a whole set of decisions of different kinds, both those related to the income, the use of the income coming in from being, in essence, the landlords of the resort. What they wanted was as much power as possible to lie out, and they set up, was it 5 or 6, Petronella? I'm not sure if Petronella's here and I can't see you against the lights. Anyway, I think it was 6 different categories of anangu. One was Mutujulu, resident people, including Ngurritja living in Mutujulu, the little town at the back of Ayers Rock there. And then a number of other communities. Another one was a category, people living on outstations in that region. And another one was a category, that is Ngurritja living over the border in South Australia. Each of those, irrespective of the fact that the numbers were vastly different, Mutujulu has far more people than live over the border and who are Ngurritja, but they should all be able to nominate 10 members, irrespective of their size, so that the large community couldn't take over, in a sense, or have more power, more directors, for example, than the people living on outstations, which is really just a handful. So one was equity, irrespective of size. Another one was they would nominate members for, say, 3 years, 10 members each, and then each group of members would nominate 2 directors, and they could choose how long, like whether it was male and a female or an older person, younger person. All these possibilities are open in the decision of that group. And also, really importantly, the process by which each group, let's talk about Mutujulu, the process by which Mutujulu Ngurritja decide on their, are going to nominate their 10 members will be decided by Mutujulu people. They will, and it's not inside the corporation. It's decided. It will be probably, I would see it as most likely a corporate instrument. I'm nearly finished.
You can get 2 more minutes, apparently.
Yeah, good. Yeah, in a minute we'll do it. So in that case, yes, the decision will be made, and it probably will be some kind of corporate instrument that sets it down in paper. It's not part of the constitution. It's like a process manual, and probably that organisation will work with each of those groups to nominate and give them assistance and so forth. But the decisions will be made by those people about theirs. Now, I'm not touting that as the ideal. All I'm saying is this resulted from deep immersion, from complex question and answer, from people drawing their own sketches of how things should work. And the principles of, firstly, power remaining, like with the use of trust monies, there had to be deep consultation with Ngurritja, not the members, with the groups themselves as to set up 3-year, 2-year, 3-year plans. And the final decision would be made by the board, but there needed to be deep input from the beneficiaries, this kind of thing. So as far as possible, and it was explicit in the discussions we had via wonderful translators, power needed to reside with Ngurritja, irrespective of who was in the corporation. The corporation acted as I think Corey mentioned this, as the decision taker, the decision makers, as far as possible, except for admin things and so forth, were the Ngurritja themselves. Thanks.
It is morning tea time. Do we have time for questions or not? I'm deferring to Julie because I know you said you were very firm on the time.
Sorry, yes. I think probably one question at the most, and then people will approach David.
Can I have one? It'll be a quick one. And we don't need microphones, so do we?
Yes, we do.
Thank you for 3 really interesting papers. Sana and Corey's gave examples of functional PBCs empowering TOs to manage their country and manage their money. And Dave has given us some wise advice about how things can and should be done. I think we all know plenty of PBCs who are relatively dysfunctional, frustrating their members and other traditional owners who are supposed to assist them to manage their country. They go to Warwick, they get nowhere. My question is, what options do they have to catalyse change, to do the sorts of things that the 3 of you are talking about?
Well, I can only give a part answer to that. I mean, I think the others should as well. They've got more experience in the field than I have on this stuff. I think it's not very... like Oric is, how do I do it politely? It's not really geared up for that. It doesn't have the knowledge. I don't know if they still do. They ran a thing called a little program which seemed to infer, they would talk about culture, but they have no knowledge. They have no knowledge of the kind of knowledge that we as anthropologists have at all. And no ways of interrogating, apart from a standard bureaucratic way of, for example, taking over a defunct corporation, establishing a new membership and so forth. But in terms of what often requires quite a significant, I think, potentially rebalancing of power, I don't think those institutions can. I mean, in an ideal world, I think there would be room for not just simply putting in new people into the same old ramshackle vehicle, which is what happens. It would be to actually get a robust vehicle for the rough journey, to use that analogy. Who can do it and where the funds are to do it, I don't know. Land councils don't have, or rep bodies don't have the funds to do it. They would be the ideal placed ones, but we know a lot of PBCs won't have a bar of their local land council, and sometimes for good reason, most often not. what do Corey or Santa have to say?
I don't have an answer, but I just, like, on that point about WIMAC obviously provides a lot of support to PBCs that don't have the same amount of resources that other groups have. So in the example that I gave, my group was very, very small, had probably more resources than quite a few in Australia, but certainly not to the other resources that the big, big Pilbara groups might have. So in that case, but as you said, rep bodies, sometimes people don't want the assistance of rep bodies, but sometimes rep bodies can step in through economy of scale and try to help out, seek those additional funds, spread the burden, and kind of lead by example those sort of processes and kind of governance structures, and just sort of say, look, here you go, this is a package that we can provide you where you don't have to be out of pocket for that. Rad, if you want to jump in. So that's something that rep bodies can do, and because they have the resources and they have the economy of scale to do that, and we've set ourselves up in order to do that though. So early on in the process, knowing that what's the post-determination space look like, we were strategically planning, like, how are we going to be able to support these groups, knowing that this was coming, that there would be these instances where PBCs were basically set up to fail. They don't have the funds to govern properly. We know that. So how can we create processes to offset that? The other thing is also that, this is my personal view, and it's kind of it's not controversial, but there's also responsibility. So we can't govern for people. They need to come and govern for themselves. So it's about how do we support people to make decisions, or to be able to give them all the possible chance for success. And I guess that's probably where I think that's all our role, to kind of help. But people need to want to govern and want to be a part of that process as well. And we can't make that happen, I guess. So it's there's a bunch of things, I think personally, that will come together to assist. But I think that's just enough of some of them. Yeah.
Morning tea time, apparently.
Right.